Time now for your business news. Rupiwa Madzena joining me in studio. Hi again, Rupiwa. So now you're going to drill down into that banking ombud report.
That's right, with some interesting insights that have come out of the relationship between consumers and their banks. So the Ombudsman for Banking Services has published its annual report for 2020. Now, it opened a record total of 7,717 formal cases. Now, this represented a 19% increase in complaints by consumers against their banks. A total of 1,338 current account complaints were opened in 2020. 35% of these cases ruled in favor of the complainants. Now, the OBS did manage to recover 16 million rand, which was paid back to consumers. FNB came out as the bank receiving the most complaints in the reporting period. The bank had over 2,000 complaints opened against it, and that is a 22% increase from 2019. Let's talk more about this now with the Ombudsman Reana Steyn. Thank you very much for your time this evening. One of the biggest insights that I thought were very interesting is that what are clients doing wrong? Because it seems that the majority of the fault actually lies with the banking clients when we talk about the online fraud. A lot of the cases that were solved were in favor of the banks in this particular regard.
Good evening. Yes, I think that it's been a problem for the last couple of years. So there are many things that can go wrong. In the past, it used to be internet banking fraud, typical phishing emails. So consumers click on a phishing email. They think they're on the bank's website. They input all their information. The fraudsters then have their password, their PIN, their bank account details. And then, of course, they transact and, because the consumer gave all that information to the fraudster unknowingly. And, of course, in those matters, it's not the bank's fault, and we cannot get the bank to pay back the money to the consumer. And in the past year, we've seen many complaints and a big rise in what they call vishing. This is telephone calls, fraudsters making phone calls to consumers, pretending to be from the bank, invariably, and then the consumer divulges all their information. They give them the password, the PIN, even the OTP that they receive, because that fraudster is so convincing to tell them they're from the bank, they're going to help them in some way stop a fraud, they just need this information, and the consumer divulges all of it. So in many cases, that's what's happening, and that is why in those cases the findings are against the consumers and not in favor of them, because we cannot make the bank pay back the money that the consumer lost through a scam like this.
But does then, the bank not have some kind of responsibility in creating extra systems that will perhaps increase the protection of their consumers when situations like this arise? So I think over the years that's exactly what they've done, which is why the fraudsters now have to phone to get that OTP, for example, because they've just added layer upon layer of security. So that's why there's now even that number that's sent to your cell phone before there can be a transaction. But then even that, the consumer reads it out to the fraudster. So I think some of it is sort of resolved through the banking apps. Because there's more safety in working on that platform. So that's one method. There's things that consumers can do. They can make sure that not all their money is available, so that even if the fraudster does get in, they do not have access to all their money. That they cannot load new beneficiaries, because if a fraudster cannot load a new beneficiary, they can only play your own beneficiaries, for example. So there's things consumers can do. And there's been a lot of things that the banks do. And then, of course, from our office and the bank side, we keep on trying to get the message out to educate consumers to be aware. Let's move on to the current account complaints, which we saw increased in the 2020 period that you reported on. What are some of the biggest complaints that consumers have with their banks in this regard? I know one of them was the closure of accounts of some consumers by the banks.
Yes, so I mean there we've seen the top main categories, subcategories on the current accounts is also fraud. So what I've just described to you
is maybe these online purchases. The fraudster somehow got hold of a credit card details, which is available if you've used your card somewhere. And then it's that 3D secure phoning, you give the password and PIN. So that's the one fraud. Closure of accounts. We've seen quite a number of complaints where the banks close the accounts. There's steps that they have to take, and then we investigate. Have they taken the steps? Have they given notice? Have they explained? Have they given sufficient notice? Because it's not a case that the bank cannot close an account, that they have to have a relationship with a client forever. But there's steps in order to close an account. You can't just do it, sort of overnight and without notice, without due regard for the consumer. So we make sure that that's in place, but we've seen some of those complaints coming through and we resolve them. And then also fees and charges. We've seen a number of complaints about that, but each case we investigate on its own merits. We've seen some matters due to COVID where people were complaining about, term extensions. They didn't understand why is the loan term longer, what's happening. So a number of those issues also, as a result of the COVID extensions, that probably also falls under current accounts.
Why would a bank go ahead and close a current account of a consumer? What would some of the biggest reasons in this regard be?
So there are many reasons why they could be closing an account. In some cases, it could be a suspicion of fraud. It could be a regulatory issue where there is definitely maybe fraud happening, which they see at the back. There's maybe investigation. So there are many reasons why they can close an account. Remember, a banker-client relationship is a contractual relationship. There's nobody forcing you to have a relationship with a specific bank. So it has to be two ways. So if the bank does not want you as a client, they obviously have to give you notice so that you can move your accounts, but they do not have to have that relationship with you. But we have seen that. They don't, so far the law does not force them to give all the reasons. The law says that they have to give them notice so that they can move their accounts and get their affairs in order. They don't have to give them reasons, let me spell out why we don't want you as a client. But in future, the law is about to change as from June this year. There's new conduct standards from the banks, and then they will have to give reasons.
Right, let's move on to the best and the worst banks, which is something that you looked at in this report in terms of the most complaints and which banks they were directed to. FNB showing a significant increase, and in fact, ABSA was very happy with themselves, even putting out a press release about the fact that they've had the least amount of complaints for the period. But what is it that people are complaining about, and really what determines whether a bank is good or bad for a consumer?
Okay, so I think we need to just put in perspective, when we report on the numbers, we do not say that that number means they're a good or bad bank. We can only report on what we see. So we have seen an increase in number of complaints against FNB. That doesn't mean that as a bank they're bad. So it could be the number of transactions, it could be the number of clients that they have at that bank. It could be the product makeup. It could be a customer service issue. So there are many reasons why consumers complain against a certain bank. It could also be that they do not resolve the matters quick enough, and that is why consumers run to our office to assist them, and we will do that. Whereas another bank, and I think that is where ABSA has been doing very well this past year, in the past that they had the highest number of complaints, and I think they took a decision to rectify that. And what they put in place worked, because they're now the lowest. You saw the numbers. They really dropped, and I think it's because of a concerted effort to resolve the complaints. I don't think it means that they don't get complaints. I think it means that they resolve it better and quicker. So I think that is where maybe the banks with the bigger numbers are falling short. But I've met with the CEO of all the big banks, and I've heard from all of them how they're going to try, because they don't want to be the worst bank. They don't want that bad publicity, and they're putting things in place. And I think maybe next year we'll see a different bank. Somebody has to have the highest number of complaints, and I think they're going to try and fix this.
Absolutely looking forward to that. Thank you so much for your time this evening. That is the Ombudsman for Banking Services, Reana Steyn.